Providing a dose of rationality, critical thinking, and skepticism from a conservative atheist perspective, this is the Bitchspot Report podcast. Every week, your host will bring you news of note and commentary on topics of interest in hopes of sparking intelligent discussion on important issues of the day. It's not pretty, it's probably not safe for work, but we tell it like it is and offer no quarter to the credulous, the gullible, or the downright stupid. It's not for the easily offended, or for the religiously or liberally minded, but it is about 90 minutes of secular conservative entertainment. So let's get right to the show. And in case you thought the last show was a fluke, here we are again. We're hard to get rid of. I've gotten some good feedback on our first show after the return, so let's keep it coming and tell everyone that you can that we've returned. If anybody has any comments or suggestions on what we could do better, please send to our email or post comments on any of our shows. It's good to be back, but just putting out a show isn't enough. We want to make a show that people look forward to and tell their friends about. So here we go again. How are we doing this week?
We are surviving.
Well, that's
yes,
good.
Survival is good. I hope everybody's either ready with their tax forms or their 6-month tax forbearance requests.
Oh, come on. We got all of our stuff done in by the end of January, had our refund back by February. We've been done for months. What the hell is wrong with people?
Well, in my case, the company I work for kind of lost the W-2s, and so won't have them out until the end of this week.
Which is completely and totally illegal. They are required by law to have them to you by the end of January. No ifs, ands, or buts. No excuses. Fuck them.
True. However, they did pay me a day's worth of wages, so I'm going to go with that. And also the other factor is because I work as a freelancer, I have some of my 1099s I have to put together, and I am going to get them done. And fortunately, California and the federal government gives us that lovely 6 months forbearance.
Yeah, I never have to worry about it. And I never have to pay their asses either. I always get a refund.
This is true. Someday I hope to be in that position. And just remember, any of you who are freelancers out there, freelancers have to remember Social Security and Medicare payments.
Yep. All right. Well, anyway, this is something we haven't really talked about, but it's something I really wanted to go over last week when we were going through our here's what the show is going to be like thing. And I was kind of thinking about it. So I wanted to take a moment for kind of this off-the-cuff discussion on guests on the show. Now, some shows where guests, I want to call it, and I don't want to be insulting, but seriously, there are some podcasts out there where guests seem to be completely incestuous. You know, they're the, if you be on my show, I'll be on yours kind of thing. And all they're really doing is they're just getting themselves out on other shows so that they can attract more listeners. You know, I really want people who are going to be interested in coming on to do something other than plug their own show. Yeah, I've already talked to a couple of people who we never got on for the last season, people who were difficult to arrange a time for, who live in completely different parts of the world. Christian, I'm talking to you. Who have said, yeah, we'll kind of try to work something out. You know, it's very hard when they're on the other side of the planet and it's hard to arrange a time. So I'm kind of looking forward to doing some stuff like that. I never wanted this to be a guest-driven show where all we do is we get people on here to talk so we don't have to do any hard work. But neither do I want to turn people down who have legitimate things to talk about. So I know I haven't asked you about any of this, but, you know, what kind of things are you thinking of as far as guests? Is there any particular types of guests? Anyone particular you'd like to get on? Anything like that?
Well, I'm not entirely certain. I'd like to find guests that obviously are knowledgeable about the subject. And maybe see if there's people out there that have a suggestion they want to talk about, because, you know, sometimes that could be something we hadn't thought of and might be a good place to drive the show to.
Right. I mean, I didn't want to be one of those people who just went around and, you know, hoard the show out for guests. We kind of left it up where if you had a complaint about something we were saying, or if you had a different idea or a different position, we invite you on to basically back up what you're saying. And we had very few people like that. We had lots of people who would say, oh, I disagree with this. And they would get on the show and they would agree with everything that we had to say. It's like, so much for disagreement. You know, I'd like to get some people who really do disagree. I'd like to get some theists on the show who can really sit down and really back up their claims. I don't think that's going to happen, but it would be nice. And I'd like to get, having Jim and the libertarians on, getting some liberals on, getting some people who they have a different view, and we can sit down and hash out which is a better position to hold. But I don't want to go chasing them around and, hey guys, you got to come on the show because we want somebody to be on. I want people to actually volunteer because they want to be on.
Well, I think we could also leave an area for, in the comments area if people want to suggest maybe they'd like to talk on the show. That'd be a thought. Some of my problems, of course, is like you, a good chunk of the people I know that might want to talk live in places like China, Europe, and it is a bit hard to put a show together when, it's 5 a.m. in the morning our time and 2 p.m. in the afternoon their time.
Right. Well, like I said, Christian, he's out in Korea, so
yeah.
I want to get him on so bad, but the timing is just going to suck, and no matter how you do it, so.
That might be best for maybe scheduling a recording session possibly for the weekend when nobody's working, so that it might be possible for us to arrange a special time just so everybody can stay up, even if some people are a little later than others.
Right, and even if you can just get in there and just record a session, we're just going to have you on for this part of the show. It's going to take us half hour, 45 minutes to record, and then everybody can go to bed. That kind of thing would work too.
Oh, I miss college days before families and everything. It was so much easier just to let's stay up all night or for 3 days and then crash for a fourth day.
Yeah, sorry, I can't do that anymore.
I can't either, and not just because I work a lot, it's just because my body just says, nope.
Yeah. I mean, I remember we used to go to conventions like back in the early 80s, and it was like, 4 days? Cool, we'll just stay up the whole 4 days. And maybe if we get tired, we'll go hang out in a video room and we'll sleep in the back for an hour, and then we'll just be up for another 48 hours.
Yeah, that's another terrible sign of getting old. Anyone here who's ever gone to conventions, back in the 80s, the video animation room was always packed because that was the only place a lot of people could see these videos. Today, you realize that with Netflix, YouTube, BitTorrents, for those of a less legal bent, it's empty because everybody can get the videos wherever they want to. It's an interesting example of how things have evolved.
Right. Well, anyway, do we have anything else to cover before we get into some... All right, well, anyway, we're going to do our Idiot of the Week, and it's going to be Lisa Wade. According to Lisa Wade, professor at Occidental College, if you understand how economics works, you're probably a bad person because you're less likely to share, less generous to the needy, and more likely to cheat, lie, and steal. In other words, if you're educated, you're probably evil. She claims that a study from 2010 shows that students who understood economics are less likely to give money to liberal causes. Maybe that's because liberal causes are more geared to those with out-of-control emotions and not those who are well-educated and intellectual.
Well, I'm a liberal in many respects, and I think, first of all, if liberals are less inclined to give, I wonder who it was on FDR's, economic staff during the Great Depression. But I think there's another problem, is that I tend to prefer to give money to individual people. And the reason is that having worked at some of these organizations, I know how easy it is to find an organization that takes your charitable donation of $1, takes the 50 cents needed to pay the person who took that charitable donation, the 25 cents for necessary business and traveling costs, and then the 15 cents to pay the salary of the spokespeople for the organization, whereupon they give 10 cents to the needy. Whereas if I hand $1 to a person, whatever that person intends to do with it, I know I have given $1, 100 cents of charity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reality is that people who are well-versed in economics are more likely to realize the futility of the liberal system of just handing money to irresponsible people and letting them continue being irresponsible. Fundamentally, let's be honest, liberalism is a failure where society needs to come up with a never-ending flood of money to hand to people who've already proven that they haven't got the slightest clue how to handle money.
Well, there's been cases like Utah, Britain. It depends on the type of aid that's given. I mean, Utah was purchasing houses and allowing people to live in them subsidized. And that program was fairly successful. Of course, there was a screening process. And so, they were screening out the people who just will not play ball. There's people on the street, you see them, mentally ill or people who just, refuse to work. them you could give $1 million and next week they'll be back on the street. And, it's unfortunate that there are people out there. But the problem is that even if you want to help people.
Well, no, I definitely want to help people, but I'm one of those, kind of think of the old saying, if you give a man a fish, you'll feed him for a day, but if you teach him how to fish, you'll feed him for the rest of his life. I want to teach people how to fish. The liberals are pulling up with trucks full of fish. I think that whole thing is just kind of stupid.
Depending on your viewpoint, you want to be more pragmatic about paying your dollars. There is not an unlimited pool of money for people for charitable donations. You've got to put your money where it does the best possible good.
Yeah, but that's not the liberal charities that she's talking about.
Yeah, and that's another problem, because looking at this, I noticed that you're given a choice of registering if they want to donate to WASH PIRG, which is left-leaning, or a nonpartisan group that lobbies to reduce tuition rates. Now, the problem I have with this is a very lazy selection if you're trying to produce an actual economic model. For one thing, students who are not left-leaning may not want to donate to a left-leaning public interest group because they feel it doesn't represent their interests.
Yeah.
As for the other one, I know a fair number of students who say, well, tuition's not that bad, and to be brutally honest, even if tuition is that bad, I don't have the money to donate to this organization because of tuition. Actually, looking right now, I'm looking at the webpage for WashPIRG, I'm not sure. And it's talking about, we have a reclaimed democracy here about Citizens United. We have a public health comment about antibiotics. We have a comment about small businesses, putting it's fairly traditional left-leaning. I'm really not going to get into it too deeply because it's what you might consider a traditional left-leaning. But the problem is that if you're not a liberal, it's kind of like if you are a liberal, are you going to donate to the Heritage Foundation?
Right. Well, she suggests that economics majors ought to be required to take quote-unquote balancing courses that teach a different kind of economics, like communism or socialism, I'm sure. Maybe she needs to get her liberal head out of her ass and stop pretending that liberalism is anything remotely worthwhile. Of
course,
it seems commonplace for many of these ivory tower educational liberals who never had to deal with the real world but can wallow in their liberal ideologies full time. It's just ridiculous.
Well, and also there could be another point going here is I would not be at all surprised to find out that this article is coming out just about the time when the university is deciding what school students have to take, what classes students have to take. Because let's face it, a lot of departments don't make their money. They don't get their budget on electives because not many students take their electives. The reason the English department is so powerful is that every damn student has to take 2 years worth of English. So it could also be that what we're seeing is fallout from the traditional, okay, how am I going to get as many students as possible into my department so when the time comes to cut up the budget piggy, I can get a bigger slice?
She's a sociology professor.
Yeah, no one takes sociology unless they have to. It's kind of the same thing with history. I love history. I'm a history major. I wrote a 300-page MA thesis on history. The fact of the matter is the only reason the history department needs a full floor in the school is that the history department has, I think, 2 years of required courses. Everyone's got to take those courses if you want to graduate. The other problem, though, I have with her is that, seriously, there are liberal economists out there that, like Paul Krugman. These guys have a lot of academic chops, have good arguments, and none of them are saying, well, oh, by the way, if you take an economics class, you're likely to be Attila the Hun. And this is an unfortunate case of, like I said, it's a case, it assigns a moral failing to what could simply be described, but maybe I'm taking economic classes and I'm coming to the conclusion this is not the best use of my money. Because I could also argue, if I wanted to write a paper, I could say that conservative Christians are far more kind than liberals because conservative Christians do tend to, by the records, contribute more to private charity in some areas.
Well,
it would be
we can argue that one.
It would be a ridiculous thing because, first of all, it's too big of a question. You're trying to paint with too broad of a brush, but I just think it's a ridiculous thing to flat out say, based on one study, that economic students are somehow turned into evil people. I mean, in the article, they just combine it. They say, okay, well, these students are coming in greedy and evil, and then the classes make them, because it actually mentioned that they claim that they're both indoctrination and induction. Right, selection. Right. And, again, the problem is that I don't see it as a very accurate study at all. I mean, for one thing, just to be honest, if you're interested in the economy, you probably also know the value of a dollar. People who get rich do not tend to throw their money around. They tend to have budgets. They tend to stick with budgets.
Right. But she doesn't care about that kind of stuff, because as far as she's concerned, and I'm not trying to speak for her, but the impression that I get from this is she's another one of those liberals who think capitalism is evil, and therefore anybody who practices capitalism, which of course everybody in an economics class is going to do, they must be evil because they're not just giving money away to people left and right for no reason.
Yeah, and see now what I would argue, and that looking at the I'm looking at the percentage rates right now, and even the percentage rates aren't. To be serious, the percentage rates really don't buy into her argument. I mean, there's a higher percentage of other arts and sciences majors that are contributing to these groups, but you're talking the difference between 5 and 15 and under 15%. And so it's not like 1% of economics students and 100% of everybody else doing this. And as for the other economics and neoclassical, most economic classes cover economics that aren't neoclassical. And I mean, it's usually a survey course because, like you said, nobody's really going to spend too much time on Marxism because Marxism kind of dramatically failed.
Well, except for these liberals who think it's the best thing since sliced bread.
And then, talking about, for instance, at the bottom of this article, it says, in doing so just isn't about sticking one to econ. It's an issue of grave seriousness as the criminal and immoral behavior of our financial leaders is exactly what triggered a Great Recession once. Except that has nothing to do with economics. The Great Recession, if you're arguing that they were criminal and immoral, then the Great Recession was triggered by criminal and immoral behavior. But for one thing, a lot of people involved in the higher levels of decision making didn't go through economics. They came up through business classes, the MBAs. Now there's some economics in that, but it's definitely not a academic study of economics.
Yeah.
And a lot of the economics professors were the ones hopping up and down screaming, "We are heading for a dramatic bubble burst."
Yeah, but nobody listened to us.
No, nobody listened. I mean,
talking about that.
From the conservative side, you had a fair number. Paul Krugman on the liberal side, so the problem with this is that if economics professors are all greedy, or economics students tend to be greedy, why are these groups some of the ones that were trying to warn us? It's a fairly silly, honestly, paper. Not as silly as some papers I've seen, but given the amount of paper you have to generate if you're a college professor, things get very silly quickly.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it's one of those things where she's kind of defining her own reality into existence, where she's just going, anybody who doesn't give to my particular brand of charities is a horrible, awful, terrible person.
Yeah.
And doesn't realize that, there's tons and tons of charities out there that have nothing to do with you and your political leaning. There's tons of conservative charities out there that people give to, but they don't fall into your little magical world that you think exists and that you think everybody has to dance around your little totem. It just gets ridiculous to watch these people.
Yeah, and really seriously, the biggest problem I think is that, I'm going to tell her something. She's a professor, I'm not. I wish I was, but I'm not. But seriously, you don't make friends by calling these people puppy-kicking baby eaters. Which, is sort of what you're saying when you're talking about stuff like this. All that does is convince them, well, we're not going to bother to listen to you.
Yeah, but she doesn't care because so many of these people, especially in the liberal arts and sociology and all that kind of stuff, they live in such a ridiculous educational echo chamber where everybody they surround themselves with has the same kind of view.
Yeah.
There's no dissent involved. Nobody's allowed to disagree because they get thrown out of the club.
Right. And let's face it, this is not just a problem with schools. This is a problem everywhere on the internet. I can't begin to count the number of boards I eventually left because by the time the moderators got finished kicking people out they didn't agree with, it was like talking to a bunch of clones.
Yeah, well, I mean, we see the same thing with the social justice warriors. Back when Atheism Plus was a thing, they spent all their time just saying, here is the official dogma to which everyone must adhere, and anybody who doesn't, we're going to throw you out and we're going to chuck you back down into the sewers because you're horrible, awful, terrible people, because nobody can possibly ever disagree with us. There's no such thing as
a loyal opposition.
Well, not just a loyal opposition, but there's no such thing as having a discussion with somebody who disagrees with you. Because as far as these people are concerned, just disagreeing is enough to make them horrible, baby-eating monsters.
Yeah, and that is unfortunately an issue that is, again, it comes up all over the United States, all over the world right now, in fact, and it is fairly corrosive because it changes discussions into battles, and battles can be won or lost, but they usually don't change anybody's mind.
Well, that's because these aren't discussions. These are people who have absolutely dogmatic views that can never be changed by anything. No evidence in the world will ever change these people's opinions. It doesn't matter to them. And I think that we've become so polarized politically, socially, economically, etc., where people hold a position because that's what they've been indoctrinated into, and nothing anybody says, no evidence, no reason, no critical evaluation will ever change their minds because that's true forever and ever and ever. Amen.
Yeah. And unfortunately, again, this is one of the reasons why if any of you are going to college, just to remind you, for someone who's taught occasionally, your professors are not objective spokespeople. Everybody has their own view. And your professors will have one too. Hopefully they will not be like this professor, or if they are, they'll at least acknowledge it to their class. But you will get a fair number of professors, a fair number of people in school who will try to pretend they're holding the objective view when it's anything but.
Exactly. I mean, you got to think for yourselves. You can't just believe whatever comes down from the front of the room. If your professors, your preachers, whoever you want to listen to, if they can't back up what they have to say with evidence, they're not worth listening to. They're just not.
Yeah, and especially if they try to shout you down. I mean, obviously sometimes a professor will have better information. Hopefully, that's why they're a professor. But they should be willing to back it up and able to back it up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, unfortunately, I run into this kind of stuff all the time where you'll get people going, well, it's essentially the appeal to authority, where they'll just sit down and say, well, yeah, no, this person is a quote unquote expert. Well, fine. Then they should have no problem backing it up. It's like when you go into the sciences, when you go into a STEM field, when you go to a university and you get a degree, your degree does not mean you are always right. Your degree means as long as you are saying what is consistent with the scientific evidence and with the methodology and everything that this science has to say, then yes, you probably have more knowledge than other people. But if you go out there and you start spouting creationism and you start doing all this other crap, I don't care what letters you got behind your name. You're no more worthwhile than some other Joe with no evidence.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, well, let's go ahead and go do some news.
Ooh, Indiana.
And now the news.
For all the talk about Indiana and their religious freedom law, there are many other things about Indiana that we ought to be looking at, for they display the utter failure of religious thinking in politics. In Scott County, Indiana, political and social pressure forced the only Planned Parenthood clinic to close its doors, even though it didn't provide abortions. And now, Scott County is home to a major HIV outbreak caused by IV drug use. The Planned Parenthood clinic was the only clinic that actually tested for HIV, and now Indiana's religious stupidity is paying the price for their bigotry. So what else will the state do? Just pray for things to magically get better? I wouldn't be too surprised.
Yeah, I'm expecting that. Or just say that obviously people who get HIV are horrible, evil people who deserve to die horrible, evil deaths. I mean, unfortunately, in some cases, I'm certain there's a number of people here who are thinking mission as planned, much like the Germans thought mission as planned when they invaded of Russia. It is unfortunate that this is happening, but, this is a trend that's going on all over the nation of, trying to shut down Planned Parenthood and other reproductive services clinics, and having an impact that those clinics also provide a vast number of other services that then go unprovided to the community. It's pretty annoying, but unfortunately par for the course. We'll eventually get a lot of people killed.
But they don't care about that. I mean, there's this ridiculous, unjustified hatred against Planned Parenthood from the religious right. They don't care about the good that Planned Parenthood does. They assume, very wrongly of course, that the only thing they do is perform abortions and provide birth control. They don't give a damn about anything. They don't care about reality. Mm-hmm. It's just, well, this is what we've been programmed to think from the pulpit, so this is what we're going to do. And so they did everything that they could possibly do to shut down all these clinics, and now they're paying the price.
Right. And I'm also going to blame the Supreme Court here. Because in a lot of these states, what's happened is the court has really pretty much said that unless you just flat out ban abortion forever, you can get away with anything short of that. And, a right that is ringed about with so many restrictions that you really can't carry it out isn't much of a right. And this is a problem we've had. They've been very successful. Planned Parenthood's under attack across the United States. And it's a successful attack, I'm sorry to say. And many groups just are suffering for HIV, for the lack of prenatal care, because Planned Parenthood also offered prenatal care for low-income families. And it's just unfortunately a really miserable situation, and sadly one I'm not surprised to hear about in relation to Indiana.
Right. I mean, it seems that all these ultra-religious states are proving time and time again how bad religion actually makes society. I mean, whether you're talking about the Deep South, where they want to stop secular education from telling children that their religious myths are wrong, or whether you're trying to protect religious zealots from actively hating and hurting gays. I mean, these aren't things that happen in more secular states.
No.
That's not to say that liberal states are any better necessarily. They've got their own set of problems. But, Jesus, fuck. Just look at how often this stuff happens where we have to talk about, oh, look, here's another state doing something stupid because everybody in the legislature are a bunch of religious retards.
Well, the problem is just on our last conversation, is that, again, highly religious people have a hard time accepting any concept of the loyal opposition, especially if they've tied their religion to dogmas that really aren't backed up in the Bible. And so this is what they have. If you're against it, you're going to hell. And it's interesting to note that as late as the 1980s, a lot of the religious right had books coming out discussing the fact that, well, they don't like abortion, but really, honestly, you can't find anything in the Bible that conclusively says the position, the biblical position one way or another. Those books either aren't in print anymore, or in some cases they've actually had those chapters changed.
Right.
And it's just an example of, a religious war with all of that entails.
Well, plus the fact that you have a bunch of religious people now for whom their religious beliefs are all-encompassing. Every single segment of their life is completely controlled by their religious beliefs. There's nothing that happens that they're not praying to God about. They're not doing all this other stuff. So they can't sit down and say, okay, this is important to my religion, and this stuff over here, yeah, I might not like it, but it's not really religious. So I can have a different view of it. Nope, it's all completely fanatical, fundamentalist bullshit.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of it, especially in America, is this view of the world is continually under siege by a devil who is active in the world. And that produces a situation where you are looking at something, and they see every action taking place in the context of, is the devil out to get me? It's quite odd. It's very odd in the sense that it's quite a fearful worldview. It's a worldview that always looks for new threats. And of course, if you're always looking for new threats, well, that's kind of the definition of paranoia. You're always going to find one, or you're going to make one.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of those things. If the only tool you got's a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
And unfortunately, it's also tied up. Let's face it. If you look at a lot of these states, oftentimes it's bound up with some fairly toxic cultures from the past. In the Deep South, religion very bound up with extremely toxic cultural holdovers from the antebellum era and then the civil rights era. And it's, I think it's going to get better, honestly, mainly because these churches are slowly losing grip on people. As fewer and fewer people are really going to church, really seeing themselves in that light.
Yes and no, though, because you're actually seeing... Now, I can understand the Deep South, because we know the Deep South is completely messed up. But, Indiana isn't something that you necessarily go, hey, that's a completely religious wingnut state. Or Kansas, necessarily. But we're getting more and more and more stuff out of Indiana between their whole, yes, you can go out and discriminate against gays, which they had to backpedal on really fast, which was hysterical. And while we're on the topic of Indiana, let's talk for a minute about that idiotic story of the pizza place that supposedly won't serve pizza for gay weddings. Now, first off, for people who aren't in the know, this whole thing was theoretical. A reporter shows up at this pizza place and asks a single employee how they felt about gays. And the employee said, yeah, I don't really have a problem with it. And then they just kept pushing and they kept going, well, if a gay person came in here and said, we want you to provide pizza for our wedding, would you feel comfortable with that? And the guy said, nah, I guess I probably wouldn't feel comfortable about that. And the whole thing just blew up all over the place over one guy who wasn't authorized to speak for the damn pizzeria in the first place, saying something that was his personal opinion, pushed at it by an idiot reporter. This particular pizza place never actually refused to sell pizza to gays. Not once. It turned into a giant liberal shitstorm where the pizza place was attacked on Yelp and Reddit and everywhere else, with people posting gay porn all over the place and referencing this pizza place, downvoting the pizza, not because it's bad pizza, but because they didn't like the theoretical view of one employee.
Yeah. Well, and also the other factor is I'm not certain, it gets into a legal question. Right now, of course, gays are not considered a protected class under the Supreme Court, and I'm not even certain, okay, I can't say here because I actually don't know how the law would work in this case, but the question is that, first of all, since they didn't say this, it seems kind of odd to attack them. I'm a little disturbed about the explosion on places like Yelp, because theoretically Yelp is just to tell your own experiences with a company. It is a warning against using social media for advertising, however. The other problem is that, seriously, if this didn't happen, you're attacking a hypothetical, and you're making the hypothetical more likely to happen in the future. There's enough problems in Indiana without deliberately seeking out places like this.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, why don't you actually go after people who actually have refused to do business with gays instead of just pick on somebody who isn't even going to do it, who's never done anything wrong in their entire existence. And then you've got the social justice warriors out there screaming and yelling and calling for people's heads. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and it is, since it's such a fraught debate, this is an area where I think the news really needs to be careful because, there are a ton of people out there who are going to be enraged because they have gay friends. We have gay friends. If you hear a place is refusing to serve your friend, you're going to get head up about it. But that means it's really important for news agencies to be very damn careful in their reporting.
You have to remember that news agencies in the modern world, they don't exist to tell people what's going on. They exist to create controversy. So, because controversy sells ad space. Yeah. You got it.
And that's why, if you'll notice, if you look at a lot of I've seen it now even on CNN, you'll generally have a rank of click on this to see the horribly sad story about the little girl who died or something like that. It's generally picked up to, get you clicking on these ads for no other reason than that they want you to click on the ads. The story isn't the point, the ad is the point.
Of course.
And unfortunately, That, of course, means that a lot of news agencies aren't going to pick up the truly important stories because they really don't want to piss people off. They want to give people the sense of, we feel good about being pissed off. That sounds kind of odd, but, a lot of stories are complex, hard, don't have a lot of easy villains or heroes in them, but that's not the kind of story that gets someone to read it in 5 minutes and then click on the new ad for the Tummy Tuck 2000.
Right. But you got to remember, that's exactly how modern social justice warriors work. They're out there to be enraged. That's their whole purpose in life. They want to go out and be mad at something so that they can feel really good when they go out and scream somebody down for not agreeing with them.
Which causes problems. Because I don't know if I'm a social justice warrior.
No,
I would
you're
be
not.
a pretty sad warrior in any shape, way, or form. But I'm involved in some of the events. There's a couple of convention groups I was talking about with sexual harassment policies, which, really seriously, if you're ever running a convention, you need to have one. You need to have one in place before you open the convention's doors. And everybody needs to know what it is because, I've dealt with conventions where they have a policy in the back sheet somewhere and nobody's ever read it. So that's helpful. But the problem is that seriously starting an attack, you can always attack later if the other side proves to be utterly unwilling to come to any compromise, but you can't walk back once you start attacking. And so it's always better to start reasonable, try to find a meeting of minds, because if you find a meeting of minds, hey, you won. You don't need to you don't need to get into a huge fight if you can get the other side saying, well, yeah, that actually sounds pretty reasonable. And then you come to a meeting of minds, and in addition, there's no screaming, no yelling, and no people refusing to speak to each other ever again.
But that's not how these people work.
That's not how some people work, because there are a lot of people on both sides. It's like you can have the most peaceful demonstration in the world. There's going to be someone in that crowd that wants to throw rocks. Yeah.
But no, these people, they play the victim card constantly. They are always the victim because they are right, and everybody who disagrees with them, well, they're not disagreeing with them. They're engaging in hate speech. They're coming out and screaming and yelling, and it's all so horrible and awful, and we should all feel really sympathetic towards these people who are so brave and bold to be out there speaking their mind. These people are morons.
And they also hurt the cause. Seriously, honestly, again, it hurts the cause because the more enemies you create, the harder it is to get change. Because the more you back people up, they're not going to move. Some people, obviously, if you're trying to talk about racial justice or something like that, and you're talking to a hardcore Southern segregationist, you probably aren't going to come to a meeting of minds. It's just not. But there was a case in library science. I don't know if we talked about this last blog post. But there were two women called themselves Team Harpy, and they essentially accused up-and-coming librarian of being a sexual predator. Said things like, it's common knowledge that women are afraid to be alone with this fellow. And he sued them. He sued them for slander in a Canadian court, and just recently they wrote an apology, full retraction using the statement, we used false and malicious statements, which is about as clear-cut a retraction as you can get. And yet there are still people saying, well, we stand with them because the cause is important. And it's like, well, no, if the cause is important, you shouldn't be standing with them. You should be pissed at them. But there are people out there who feel that whatever their cause, that there is nothing you can do wrong in its service. And that is not right.
Oh, yeah. Well, you got to remember, these people don't actually want to solve any of the problems they claim they want to solve. They have no interest whatsoever. They don't want to solve racism because if they solved racism, they'd have nothing left to do. They don't want to solve sexism. They want to continue to make it look like these things are out there so that they continue to have something to sit and point at. They don't want to fix anything.
Well,
because having the problems makes them feel important.
Yeah, well, it's like you also get in problems that oftentimes these groups, you get splinter groups splitting off. Feminism, you had second wave feminism, neo-feminism that split off from primary feminism, and then started attacking, sadly enough, I knew a professor in school who was attacked for not being feminist, and she had actually started her career back in the 1950s. And it's like, no, the world today is not It's not the world I think is perfect, but still, I feel very uncomfortable about somebody attacking a woman who entered a male-dominated field in the 1950s as not being feminist. But yeah, you get stuff like this happening a lot. And again, a lot of it comes to controversy sells, whether it's a newspaper or getting people to listen to your cause. Controversy, argument, shouting seems to attract people more, especially in today's, in our media-driven culture.
Yeah, and we've got a few seconds to get your attention, so we're going to do the most crazy, insane shit that'll make you look at us while we're jumping up and down like a bunch of monkeys.
And of course, one of the problems is a lot of times groups like that miss getting attention for getting anything done. Because, I've known groups that did manage to get the attention. The problem is they had no idea what to do with it. No one had actually bothered to think about, well, we've got our 15 minutes of fame. What do we do with our 15 minutes of fame? Because you only get 15 minutes of fame. If you don't use it, you can't put it in the bank and use it later.
Well, I mean, that's kind of why Atheism Plus died a sad, pathetic death, was because, they got their 15 minutes of fame and they didn't want to do anything with it. If you looked on their forums, they were voting on what we should do. Oh, we should give money to this, we should give money to that, we should work towards this, and then they all picked the option, we should sit on our fat, stupid asses and type insults into the computer.
Yeah, well,
that was their entire job.
On Wall Street, that was one of the big problems, is that they got a tremendous amount of attention. A lot of people back then were saying, yeah, there's major problems with the way things happened, but there was no central leadership, no ability to generate a coherent plan. And of course, eventually people realized that, well, we're just watching a lot of people sitting on Wall Street, and then the next story came up and that was the end. I mean, if you're ever running any kind of political movement, again, much as with the sexual harassment policy, you do not want to be trying to think of what you're going to do with your 15 minutes of fame when you have it.
Talking about the sexual harassment policy thing, their problem was, it wasn't that they wanted people to have a rational sexual harassment policy. They wanted every convention to admit that men were a bunch of predators who were out there harassing women, even though they could never produce a single demonstrable, provable case where anything ever happened to anyone.
Well, yeah, and then there was that one unfortunate person who said that, sexual harassment accusations are always true. I forget what her name was. She was someone involved in it. But, unfortunately, several police officers made the comment that the problem with that is that she's missing the fact that when you first interview somebody, you're not supposed to be critical, because that's a part of the interview process. You're trying to gather information. It doesn't mean that you simply take any accusation of sexual harassment, assault, robbery. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't mean that you don't take it and analyze it. It just means that during the initial process, you are trying to get information out, and a person is going to have a hard time giving good information if they feel that they're not being trusted at that point. That's just, that's basically interview 101. But it was taken to argue on some people, and I will mention that a fair number of people criticized her for making those comments, stating that, no, you have to admit that people make mistakes. I mean, let's be honest, you don't even have to go into the claims on some part that there might be malicious misreporting. Seriously, people make mistakes. People misinterpret what other people are doing. That's one reason. I mean, unfortunately, one of the biggest threats I've always thought of at both conventions and colleges is the fact you got 18-year-olds and booze mixing together, which is never a good combination.
Yeah, well.
But so I think we've gone on this. Anything else?
Nope, let's go ahead and do the next one.
Ah, yes, Turkey's favorite berserk button, Armenian genocide. Now, normally when you manage to kill off 1.5 million people, you probably shouldn't be yelling at people for calling it a genocide. But Turkey has always, Turkey throws people in jail for this, let's be honest. And the Pope just recently made a statement stating that the Armenian genocide was one of the first recognized genocides of the 20th century. And to be blunt and a little vulgar, Turkey collectively lost its government shit about it. But they withdrew the ambassador from the Holy See, and the problem is, a lot of this is just that, first of all, yeah, it was a genocide. It may not have been a genocide in the same sense as, say, the Holocaust was, but that's very much asking what was worse, to be beaten to death by baseball bats or set on fire. I mean, and the problem is that this is an area where Turkey is pretty much standing alone. Just about everybody else agrees that this was a genocide. I mean, you had 1.5 million Armenians they were executed, they were tortured. It was a really horrible situation. So the other problem is that the Pope actually said, what the Pope said is that the extermination of 1.5 million Armenian Christians in what is generally referred to as the first genocide of the 20th century and the subsequent annihilation of thousands under the former totalitarian regime are tragedies that still live in the memories of the present day generation. So, it's odd because Turkey didn't have to lose their head over this. They could have just said, well, we disagree with the characterization that this was a genocide.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of sad to see how butthurt some people get over things that happened in the distant past. I mean, let's be honest, nobody alive in Turkey was around back in World War I. The idea that somebody used a word they didn't like for something nobody alive was responsible for is a bit overly emotional and absurd as far as I'm concerned. And besides, they're really getting mad at Pope Francis when he wasn't the one who actually said any of that. It actually came from Pope John Paul II in 2001, where he wrote a statement. They're mad at Pope Francis because he said it. It's not anything new, guys.
Yeah. And it's one of these things that is, it's unfortunate, and it's going to be a continuing block to Turkey getting into the EU, if Turkey ever is going to get into the EU. Really seriously, it's an example of people who have become so totally invested in something that long after it ceased to be a pragmatic concern. I mean, nobody is going to invade Turkey if they say it was a genocide. No,
nobody cares.
Yeah, pretty much except for Turkey, it's settled ground. No one's going to sue them. In truth, it would probably make things easier, but the government is so prickly over it.
Well, it's pretty much like Germany and Nazis. You can't talk about the Nazis in Germany or they'll throw you in jail.
Yeah.
Well, guys, it's time to get the hell over it and accept reality happened.
Well, for the Nazis, it's a different viewpoint. I mean, you can talk about the Holocaust in the sense of a textbook but Germany's main fear is they don't want people charging up and down their streets waving swastikas back and forth. Now, as a free speech advocate, I disagree with that. Because honestly, in America, there's very little more damaging to the cause of the resurgent Fourth Reich than to see a bunch of people, beer guts in all their beer gutted glory, running around waving Nazi flags. I mean, it doesn't so much look terrifying as it looks sad. But on the other hand, when most of these laws were passed, Germany was existing in a considerably different, situation, having just come out of the Nazi years. So I can see Germany's viewpoint of that. Turkey, on the other hand, for one thing, let's be honest. It was not the current government of Turkey that even engaged in that genocide. It was the Ottoman Empire in its dying days.
Yeah. It wasn't. Yeah, it really wasn't even Turkey to begin with. So what this whole point where national pride gets completely out of control, guys, you need to deal with reality. Knock it off. The other thing I actually was thinking was funny, they've actually got ambassadors to the Vatican? I mean, why? It seems rather absurd to stick a guy in a nation of 842 people to negotiate with a guy in a dress and a silly hat.
Well, I think probably a lot of that has to do with the Catholic Church is pretty widespread. So it's probably, you have ambassadors to the Holy See, and that's how you talk sometimes. If you want to ask the Pope to put pressure on a bishop in your own country, it probably makes it easier to talk to the Holy See. And also, there's, you could argue that there is a certain historical precedent. I mean, I would argue that, well, Liechtenstein probably has about as much justification to be considered a nation as the Holy See does.
I'm sure Liechtenstein has more than 842 people in the entire country.
I think they have like 1,000. They're a dinky little country. Let us check. The glory of the internet. Some of you younger people have never lived without the internet. Trust me. None of us old folks miss it. I mean, none of us old folks miss the days of having to go through card catalogs. Okay, Liechtenstein has 37,000 people, so it is somewhat larger than the Holy See. It's still just
Yep.
a dinky country.
That's true.
Mouse that roared, indeed. But yeah, I mean, this is really, there are a ton of historical precedents for it. The Young Turk government is claimed to have been a major part of it. Probably that's one of the reasons why it is such a hot-button issue in Turkey. But in all honesty, this is a case where all Turkey did was call attention to something the whole rest of the world agrees on. Which could quite possibly, because, the Turkish government is becoming much more nationalistic, much more Islamist in some respects, although that word means so many different things depending on who says it.
I've got friends in Turkey, and they say it's getting bad. Yeah. It used to be very secular, and that's not secular anymore.
Yep, and
so it's falling apart, and with shit like this, what a bunch of babies.
Well,
seriously,
and it's one of the problems is that possibly the biggest problem is given the instability in the area, really seriously, we don't want Turkey to go bad. I mean, and then there's the other problem is that Turkey is already, getting increasingly hostile to the Kurds, has been hostile to the Kurds for some time. And what's going on in Iraq is causing great concern in Ankara.
Yeah, but what do we care? Because all of our friends over there are evil fuckers anyway.
Yeah, honestly, I hate to say it, but if I had a choice between allying with Iran and allying with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, I'd choose Iran in about 2.8 seconds. Right. Mainly because it takes me about 2.8 seconds to really say Iran in this long and happy voice. Because in all seriousness, our allies are little thieves that make money because they pump oil out of the ground, but don't really have any other functioning form of economy. And our main enemy is a nation of 80 million people that manufactures everything from cars to jets. So I would much rather prefer to deal with Iran than I would Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
Yeah, exactly. But, we've got our own business, and as long as they do what we say, hey, we're your best friend.
Yeah. Except when we're sending money to people like ISIS or letting our citizens send people with ISIS. That, I will have to say that is one problem I have, is that people say, well, only private citizens are sending money to ISIS. Except the problem is that these are some of the most heavily controlled countries in the world. And you're telling me they can't stop their own citizens from sending lots of money to people like ISIS?
Especially the really successful, super wealthy people who are doing it. It's not poor people who are sending a couple cents here and there. We're talking people who are sending millions and millions of dollars to ISIS because they really want to take over the frickin' world.
Yes, they won't be successful, but unfortunately they are actually managing to do a hell of a lot of damage. I mean, they finished blowing up one of the old ancient Assyrian cities a few days ago. So that's legacy and history that we're just never going to get back. Anything that we didn't discover in that site is gone forever.
Yeah, I'm really not sure, and I was thinking about this a while back, but if I were Iran, Iraq, any of the countries that ISIS is really active in, I would take every single one of my national treasures, put it in a crate, send it to the U.S. and say, hold this for us.
There's been some argument. I mean, there's been some very sarcastic comments about how, the British Museum sent some artifacts back to Iraq that are probably now destroyed. That maybe the British, and this is a problem. I mean, Iran has been, I think Iran has been removing some. Iran, of course, is much more stable than Iraq is. Iraq's just a complete cluster. There is no real way to describe how bad Iran is off right now. I mean, Iraq is. When you consider that they're afraid they technically have an army of over 250,000 men. ISIS, I think, numbers 30,000 fighters at the most, and Iraq is afraid they're going to lose one of their larger cities, and that they're having a problem holding on to it. I mean, that is a utterly dysfunctional military. Really seriously, ISIS should not be the problem it is, because ISIS just does not have nearly the firepower that some people think they do. It's just that Iraq's military, thanks to the machinations of the former prime minister, was utterly dysfunctional.
Well, plus the fact they're used to us doing all their fighting for them. So
yeah, well, I mean, and that one of the issues was when Malachi came in, the Americans were still in Iraq training the Iraqi army. Said all of a sudden the writing was on the wall. Good officers and good NCOs who couldn't pay bribes got kicked out, and guys came in who were primarily known for their ability to pay a certain amount of money from the people hiring them. And they saw their positions as, okay, now I can extort money from the population. Needless to say, when the going gets rough, that kind of soldier takes the stolen goods and boogies for the hills.
Yeah, well, you got to remember, they also did fire all the military in Iraq and said, oh, by the way, you've got all your guns, but you have absolutely no job skills and you have no way of getting another job. Wasn't that nice of us?
Paul Bremer, otherwise known as somebody who, why the hell did anybody think this person should be giving orders at all? I mean, this is one of the problems the Republicans had in Iraq. The Republicans said we're not going to nation build. And if you're not going to nation build, why the hell did you blow up the government of the nation you just invaded? I mean, in all seriousness, upon the invasion of Iraq, the idea of nation building you would think would be kind of a given. But it was not, and I think we've gone over that disaster piece many times.
All right, so we'll just go ahead and move on to the next.
This thing.
All right, this is awful. I'm sure you'd agree, but a professor at UCLA has been called racist for daring to do something horrible to a black student in his class. Professor Val Rust dared to suggest that a black student in his class use proper English grammar in his paper. The horror, the horror. A group called Called to Action, with a 2, because, grammar and all, graduate students of color organized a sit-in to protest what they call microaggressions against black students. Yes, apparently teachers aren't there to teach. They're there to allow students to revel in improper grammar, poor spelling, and incorrect use of the English language. Holy shit.
Well, the problem I have is that generally, they would have hated me. I put red ink all over the papers. The problem I'm having is that this professor is a professor of education and information. And to be blunt, language is a big part of doing, this field. I'm not certain what language he saw, but the fact of the matter is that you do have to be able to write in a certain standard way. It's like, aircraft pilots generally have to speak English in a certain way, which is why you'll notice a lot of aircraft pilots, have certain speech patterns. It does not do a student any favors to let them out of school with writing patterns or speech patterns that are going to hurt them when they're looking for employment.
All right. I mean, like it or not, Ebonics is not proper English. And by the time you get to the university level, you're supposed to know that. All right, now granted, lots of kids are coming out of high school unable to read and unable to spell, particularly those who come out of the ghettos and the lower echelons. But this is called doing people a favor. It's not microaggression, it's education.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the thing I got, because my dad went to UCLA on the GI Bill, and he mentioned that he saw the professor maybe 3 times, because you would go into this huge-ass classroom, and, there would be the TA at the professor would give a lecture at the far end, and then you would see the TA for the rest of the week. Having a professor take time out. Now, I will say, okay, before we say anything else, we don't have exactly what he wrote. Nobody bothered to provide us that. So it is always possible that the comments were inappropriate. I'm going to give that right now. On the other hand, sometimes if you're editing a paper, you have to be harsh. You're saving nobody's time by saying, oh, this isn't bad when it looks bad. Looking right now at the quote that the students of color had, I'm seeing right now, just as a person, is that these people are way too much in love of big words.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, doesn't it sound like somebody went through the thesaurus and just grabbed a bunch of words at random? I mean, shit, if the student could speak that way in the first place, there wouldn't have been a problem.
Yeah, or there may have been. I mean, another factor is there may have been a problem, because I know a lot of professors that say, look, let's get away from the stereotype that we show how educated we are by using an 8-syllable word when a 1-syllable word will do. And that is important. I mean, again, if you're talking about, if your department is education and information, you want to be able to communicate to people. And that doesn't simply mean not speaking slang. It also means avoiding trying to use excessively complex language when simple language will do. That's not always possible. I do not want my neurosurgeon to start using simple language when he's talking about cutting into my head. But equally, if I'm giving a lecture to a public interest group or trying to explain a policy to somebody, you just want to use you want to use the language that is as complex as you need it to be, no more, no less. And I find this case, unless the student was called out in class, I mean, like, for instance, if this story said he called the student out in front of class and publicly dressed him down for this, I would say, yeah, you got a problem because that's inappropriate behavior just generally. It doesn't matter the race of a student. If you're going to call a student out like that, you do it privately during office hours. But we don't get that here. We get the thing that he's saying he corrected grammar and spelling issues on some students' paper. And
which is his job. That's what he's there for.
And to be honest, depending on how much effort he put in it, he may have gone above and beyond his job, because I know some professors whose attitude is, you're in college. If you cannot handle the simple grammar of this class, you do not belong in college. I'm not going to try to carry you. And then I know other professors who will work very closely with students, because, it's not just students who come from schools that do not give you the best education. You also get students who are coming from other countries who speak English as a second language. And I know professors who work very, very hard with these students to ensure that they can achieve their best in the class, and they're not going to be held back by an issue like their comprehension of language. So at first glance, this looks to be unfair to the professor.
Oh, absolutely.
Part of this is a problem, and this is just for people who don't know, since we do have people who are not American on this podcast. A lot of schools in minority districts, because of the way budgetary situations are handled, they don't have AP classes. Some of them don't have any advanced English classes. So you can get students coming out of these schools who are quite bright, quite skilled, but have simply never received the educational opportunities other students have had. And that's why something like this, I'm a little disturbed, again, stressing that this is all we know about the story, so presuming there's nothing else in this story, I'm a little disturbed at trying to zing a professor for going out of his way to correct grammar and spelling issues.
Yeah, but this is really just more liberal social stupidity. I mean, there's way too many universities out there that think that the educational process should be a safe space where nobody's ever told they're wrong and nobody's ever allowed to fail, no matter how badly they perform. I mean, the last thing liberals want is for their ideologies to be challenged in any way, shape, or form. They don't want to be told that they're wrong. They don't ever want to even encounter the possibility of being wrong.
Well, and the problem is that for a lot of students, the first class I failed for reasons other than being a lazy jerk were in college. I mean, in all honesty, college is the first place that a good student will go to where failure is indeed an option. You will have hard classes, especially if you go for the teachers that are the more difficult teachers, who tend to be the most rewarding teachers. You will be challenged. And cases like this, where you react so poorly to being challenged, is damaging to yourself. I mean, personally, I had a African American professor when I was going to CSULB, and God Almighty, some of the papers I got back from him looked like he had butchered a cow and let the blood drip all over the papers, and it was brutal. He would go through the papers, every misplaced comma, every screwed up semicolon, and that was before he got to the subject of the papers, because he said, look, to the class, I don't care what you know. If you can't talk about it, why should I listen to you? And it's a good point.
Yeah, it is.
And so I think that I'd like to keep track. In fact, maybe we should keep track of this, and next week see if we can find any more information about this, just to make certain that there was nothing out there that was problematic. Because in all seriousness, it doesn't reflect very well on the student association.
Yeah, but that you have to. It's not a student association. It's not something official for the school. Sure. I don't think. I think it's a bunch of crazy liberals who got together and said, you can't make anybody feel bad about anything that they do, because our whole point in life is to sit around and feel good about ourselves.
Yeah, let me see what's a call to action. Graduate students of color. Yeah, that doesn't sound like it. I mean, at most, it's probably recognized by the university in the sense that they filled out the paperwork so they could put flyers on the campus. And there's, they staged a sit-in to protest,
to to protest feeling bad. And I mean, that's really what is getting to me about all this crap. I mean, the American educational system is a cesspool anyway, but so much of it is just, when did we start raising kids to be weak, pathetic losers?
Well,
I mean, seriously, where they can't be challenged at all.
And the problem I have is that, like I said, challenge is good. Now, there are teachers out there who think bullying is challenging, and of course, that is not the case. But I'm looking at another page with some more information about the sit-in, and apparently they're beginning to antagonize other graduate students, including a number of minority graduate students who are saying, "Look, this is really going a bit far," which is good. I mean, it's important to recognize that in most of these cases, you're talking about the minority that's yelling and screaming and running about. You're not talking about the vast majority of students who generally handle things much better.
Yeah, but that's the problem, is these people can't handle anything. I mean, these people want safe spaces. They want trigger warnings on everything so that they don't ever feel bad about anything that they ever encounter. I mean, there was a story that I came across a while back where a university was going to have a debate on abortion, I think. And another group on campus, they freaked out. They demanded that the whole thing be thrown off campus because somebody who had been raped might see it and feel bad. And then they went out and they insisted that they have other alternate experiences going on campus at the same time. They set up a safe space with Play-Doh and plushies so that everybody could go in and cuddle if they felt bad. It's like, what the hell is wrong with you people?
That seems a little odd.
I mean, seriously, isn't college the place to expand your experiences? Isn't it where you're supposed to go to learn things, not to hide from the world? What's wrong with you people?
See, the problem is I can see that somebody who has suffered, an attack of some kind could be worried, but in truthfulness, I'm not.
But if they're worried, they don't have to go to the talk.
Because the talk
it's not mandatory.
Right, and the talk is...
But the idea of going, well, screw it, man. Just because these people exist on this planet, I'm nervous or I don't feel good, so I gotta go cuddle with puppies.
Yeah, I mean, and my own field, slave trade, I mean, God, I don't even want to think what people would think about that if I tried to give a lecture on that. But yeah, I mean, it is... I think one of the problems is that some people aren't happy about the fact that college, you're an adult. I mean, college is your first entry into the big scary world of adulthood. And for some people, evidently, that they seem to worry about that.
But these people aren't adults. I mean, they're physically adults, but emotionally, they're not. Because they've lived their entire lives with helicopter parents who never let them fail, who have always told them how wonderful and special and precious little flowers they are, and they still think that now that they're out on their own, that's how they need to be treated.
And I think part of it may be, although I don't know if anyone's ever done a study on this, and how easy it is to keep in touch with people. I mean, when we were growing up, obviously the only way you got in touch with mom and dad if you weren't at home is you found a phone and you called them. If you had the 25-cent or actually 5 cents to put it in, dating ourselves, to put into the payphone. Of course, these days, 90% of kids have cell phones. They can be in continuous contact with their parents if they want, and their parents.
Well, yeah.
And I'm not certain how that's impacted people.
Oh, we already know how it's impacted people. We already know that all of these self-important little twits, they can't handle reality. They just can't. I'd have to go and look up the study. But there was a study recently where a lot of these kids who have never had to deal with failure, they've never had to deal with disappointment, they've never had to have their views challenged. These people are complete emotional wrecks.
Might be interesting to look at, but yeah, I can see the problem because unfortunately, having your beliefs challenged, whatever they are. I mean, of course, when we look at this at UCLA, we see the same thing at like Bob Jones University on different subjects. But being able to deal with your views being challenged is one of the core projects of the university, or it's supposed to be a core project of the university.
But it's not anymore. That's not how they operate.
A lot of universities it is, and although I know a fair number of professors at Fullerton who really do challenge your views. And of course, a lot of this depends on the professor, the department, the culture of the particular university and department. A big place like UCLA, I mean, you're not even talking so much about a university when you're talking about UCLA. You're talking about like a dozen little universities. UCLA would be a not so small town if you just stuck it off by itself. But yeah, I mean, I find it very unfortunate that they chose this method. Apparently they also had a sit-in his class. And there are other professors. The head of the California Association of Scholars points out that it's a professor's job to correct grammatical errors. And I do not think it constitutes racism. It constitutes a conscientious professor.
But they don't want that. That's the last thing in the world they want.
I'm honestly a little puzzled by that because, like myself, I always love my professor's comments, generally because they also gave me keys on that all-important final exam that's coming up. What can I say? I'm not always interested in knowledge for knowledge's sake alone.
Right.
So,
okay.
Let us
move on.
Okay, the Obama-Castro summit. You probably heard people howling from Republican headquarters all across town, wherever you are. As everybody knows, Cuba has for the past 60-odd years been the source that is all that is evil. Fidel Castro rules on his dark throne, the rings of power that wrong Dark Lord. But you get the idea. Cuba has been pretty much untouchable in American politics, mainly because of the existence of the Cuban exiles in Florida, which of course is a very important state when it comes to presidential elections. So there's two factors about what's happening with Obama. First of all, he's a lame duck president, so he feels he can do this without harming Hillary, if she is indeed the candidate who runs, as well as helping, in some respects, forge a bit of a foreign policy legacy. But equally, what's happened is that Obama, by making this connection, it's looking like the political winds are shifting in Florida. More and more of the Cuban exiles, because, again, we're not talking about first-generation exiles now. We're often talking second, third, generation exiles who have lived in America all their lives, are beginning to argue increasingly that whole relations, political, diplomatic, economic with Cuba, not only is a good idea, but it is also the best route to changing the Cuban government. Which is pretty much what people have been saying for the last 60 years. But hey, at least we're finally on board. The president is also going to be removing Cuba from the state sponsor of terror list. So what does this mean for the future? And I think, for one thing, it may actually mean a radically improved economic situation down south, because Cuba's always been a major missed opportunity when it comes to investing in new markets. Cuba's 90 miles off Miami. You don't get much closer to that. So it's going to be interesting, and I think the Republicans are sweating because one of the things that this is arguing, and a bunch of political theorists are arguing, this may mean that the Cuban-American voting bloc is in play. That they are no longer a reliable vote for the Republicans. And that could mean that Florida is really much more in play, and that is not a good sign for Republican presidential ambitions.
Yeah, well, you got to remember that the whole reason that Obama is doing some of this stuff is, he's trying to leave a legacy, and his legacy hasn't been doing so hot lately. I mean, granted, okay, it's been stupid with all the shit we've done with Cuba since the 1960s. They should never have been on the terrorist watch list, which is absurd. They should never have been, essentially, let's be honest, we've been harming Cuba for 40, 50 years now. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't make any sense. We don't get anything out of it. They're not a danger to us. There are no more Russian missiles posted in Cuba. they're all going to Iran now. So we can whine about that now.
and of course, one of the biggest points is that if the objective is to change Cuba's behavior or change Cuba's government, I think we can safely say that this policy that we've had in place ever since the 1960s has not worked. Castro was not overthrown by his people in a rage and his body carted to Miami. Castro's retired and is happily living comfortably. The policy did not work. It was a failed policy. When we can look at our relationship with China, our relationship with many nations, that they do moderate and change their behaviors based on economic self-interest. Our embargo removed any impetus for Cuba to change its behavior based on economic self-interest. So that is an example of just how failed that policy is. And, I think one of the things that is going to happen is you're going to see this. My bet is that Cuba relatively quickly will become very closely tied to America once we let the economic barriers fall. For, again, the simple reason we're 90 miles away from Cuba.
Right, and we've got all the stuff that they want. They've got some stuff that we supposedly want. I don't know. And, the closeness helps.
Yeah, and, the other factor is that if the Republicans, now some Republicans have claimed that they will, block this, go back to the embargo if they are voted into the White House. I personally don't see that happening. I mean, if the embargo goes away, if our economic blockade of Cuba goes away, by January, when the new president comes into the Oval Office, I'm certain there is going to be more than enough economic pressure to keep it down. And of course, by that point, he's not really going to be that concerned. He'll be in the office. There won't be any need to pander to these groups. And 4 years later, they'll be completely forgotten. I mean, there is a big argument that right now the most important aspect of relaxing the Cuban embargo is whoever is in the White House, come 2016, after the 2016 elections, he will benefit from the economic improvements by trade with Cuba.
Well, realistically, there's no reason to embargo Cuba. They're no danger to us. They've never really been a danger to us. It's just a bunch of political dick-waving, as always. And it doesn't make any sense except to say, oh, well, we didn't get our way, therefore we're just going to hold this island hostage, right, and we're not going to let anybody do anything nice for them. And it's like,
that is, to be honest, for instance, there's a number of countries that have actually, Canada and a number of other countries have passed laws forbidding their businesses to cooperate with the Helms-Burton Act, to cooperate with the American embargo of Cuba, which has put a number of multinationals in a hard position because they're in a position of either violating, EU or Canadian or another country's law or violating the American embargo. But the fact of the matter is that nobody else in the world sees any relevance to our actions in Cuba. I mean, you can compare that to Iran, where despite some complaints about how the U.S. is acting, the rest of the world does agree there is a good reason behind trying to pressure Iran to enter into this, nuclear agreement. You don't get any of that in Cuba. You don't even get that with American citizens in Cuba. I mean, there's a ton of people who, quote, don't go to Cuba, but do go to Cuba, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've had American tourism in Cuba, whether we want to admit it or not.
And the other thing is again, if you want to make the Cuban government more friendly to America, having American tourists go to Cuba is a good thing. I mean, I can think of nothing more likely to change Cuba's political stance than for the mayor of Havana to look down and realize all of a sudden that 40% of his budget is coming from American tourists. The fact of the matter is that right now, for many Cubans, there was no downside to, taking a political stance against America because there's no money coming into the country from America except, remittances from Cubans in Miami and things like that. But the best thing we could do would be break this embargo. If we want to keep up limited components of it, like for instance, not selling Cuba certain, military systems and things like that, which I don't think is going to be an issue, that's fine. But let the tourists go. Let the money flow in. Let them build, resorts like they had before Castro came in, and I think you'll see a dramatic change between Cuba and Miami. I wouldn't be surprised if 2 or 3 years after you relax the embargo, you'll have dozens of ferry and short-range airline services going from Miami to Cuba.
Oh, sure. Well, my question really is, what does Cuba need with a start? Oh, wait a minute. No, that's something else. What does Cuba need with the military systems anyway?
Well, right now...
Does Cuba have a military, of any importance?
Well, Cuba actually has I don't know how the military is right now, but during Grenada, you got to remember that their National Guard units gave us a fair amount of trouble. Granted, they lost, but, losing to the U.S., it's kind of like losing to Mike Tyson. You managed to land a couple of blows on his nose and make him bleed. Okay, that was actually a win for you. And Cuba, during the 60s and the 70s, the Cuban military was heavily involved in Africa and Angola and what became Zimbabwe and those areas. And actually, the Cuban military was ranked fairly high. Of course, right now, they don't have any. The Cold War's over. And right. Cuba really, I would say Cuba does not have much need for that anymore. What they have need more for is money. Now, one thing Cuba does export all over the world are doctors, which, is a very impressive achievement. Cuban doctors are ranked very highly.
Right.
And that's another position where the United States and Cuba could work together. I hate to say it, but if we have a problem with a lot of states not having sufficient numbers of doctors for medical care, that is a potential avenue where we in Cuba could cooperate. America could help fund Cuban doctors going to other countries as part of disaster relief. There are a lot of areas where America and Cuba could cooperate profitably for both parties.
Oh, plus the fact all you have to do is open up the American schools and let the Cuban doctors flood in. And it's good. It's win-win for everybody.
The thing is that for people arguing that this is somehow condoning Cuba's government, it's not. We dealt with Stalin, we dealt with Mao, we've dealt with dictators. Simply saying that trying to pretend they don't exist is not a profitable exercise does not mean you condone everything they do. What it does mean is you think that this is a better way of making the situation more palatable than simply trying to blockade them. And let's face it, it's a blockade that only hurts the common Cuban people. I strongly doubt Castro ever went without a meal because of our blockade.
Oh, I'm sure he didn't.
Yeah, so
and now it doesn't really matter because he's just hanging out in his palace. He's not in charge anymore. He doesn't really do anything. Why are we worried about Castro anymore?
Which I'll point out is a pretty impressive.
Old Castro, not new Castro.
It's a pretty impressive feat that he actually relinquished power. That's not as common as you think it is. And I do remember one interview with him where he did say he thought that God put him on this planet just to annoy all the American presidents he outlived. Which, when you think about it, he's outlived a lot of American presidents, and especially given how many times we were trying to kill him. When he first came to the UN back in the 60s, there were jokes in the newspaper about him and his staff cooking their chicken in their hotel room, and a lot of really nasty jokes. Of course, now we know that it was probably a good thing you were cooking your chicken in your hotel room because the CIA was totally trying to kill you. And so for America and Cuba to come to some kind of reapproachment is, I think it's a glorious thing. Because I've never liked the idea of using embargoes against countries where they primarily hurt the common people.
Yeah, well, it's pointless to have it.
Yeah.
Let's just be done with it. Let's stop pretending that we're in charge of everybody, and just. And just honest. Live and let live.
Live and let live, and just accept the fact that honestly, a Cuba that is closely integrated with America's markets, that has, a Cuba where you're wealthy enough, where you find out that, every 2 or 3 weeks you go to visit your friends in Miami who left during that old revolution that, only the old people care about anymore, is going to be a Cuba that will probably far more quickly become democratic, than a Cuba that's just locked off and forced to stay on the island. And to be honest, again, we've dealt with much more horrible people than Castro. We have dealt with far more horrible people than Castro. So
we've funded far more horrible people than Castro.
Our good friend Hussein, for those of you who are a little younger, we must remember before he became the second Adolf Hitler in the Middle East, Hussein was our stern, good ally and bulwark against Iranian fanaticism. I remember stories in the New York Times cheering how, describing him as the brave secular leader of Iraq who is protecting the Middle East from Iran's fanaticism.
And all the people that we've propped up in South America.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one point that a lot of people today, because we don't our history classes generally don't go over it, is that you have to remember, if you're talking about Latin American Cuban distrust of America, when we helped fund the coup in Guatemala, about 250,000 people died as a result of that over the course of the next 10 or 15 years. When we funded Pinochet, thousands of people died. The term "the disappeared" is referred to people who American-backed regimes simply just pulled out and you never saw them again, and their children were either adopted out to other people or vanished as well. So the U.S. has really been in bed with a lot of horrible stuff in Latin America, and we need to think about that when we're talking about relations with Cuba or other Latin American peoples and governments. Because, there is a lot of baggage, and just because it's not taught in American schools doesn't mean it isn't taught in Latin American schools.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that we sit around and we teach all this horrible stuff like, oh, yes, Castro was in bed with the Russians, and they were going to put nukes 90 miles off our border and all this other stuff. But we don't talk about all the things that we've done that are just as bad in other countries, just as bad or worse, because we don't talk about our own dirty laundry. We're too busy looking at everybody else's.
Well, and just one example is the fact that, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the quid pro quos was that we were to remove our Jupiter missiles, which were nuclear-tipped missiles, much like the ones that the Russians had in Cuba, and we had placed those missiles in Italy and Turkey where they could target the heartland of the Soviet Union. So, at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's not widely known, but our quid pro quo for Russia leaving Cuba was we dismantled those missiles and pulled them out of Turkey and Italy. And, but that's something that's not always taught, especially in high school. Some books do get into it, other books don't. And, unfortunately, to be honest, I'm not certain if it's deliberate or just the fact that, history teachers always have to teach more history and they never give them more time to teach it. But
I'm sure a lot of it is political correctness.
Well, some of it probably political correctness, depending on, unfortunately, I would say of all high school textbooks, history books are probably the most politicized because it is innately a political subject.
Unfortunately, and that's why I really don't like it, because I want it to be a fact-based subject. I don't care what agenda you have. Just tell the facts as the facts are and stop pretending that you can control knowledge.
Well, the problem is that, at least in history, even if you're just going to stick to facts, there's so many facts out there that you can really change the book by what facts you choose to include. I mean, how much time are you going to spend on the Gilded Age? How much time are you going to spend on the Progressive Era? What parts of what are you going to include? And it really is difficult, especially then, and since we're talking high school, you get the parents coming in and getting all upset, saying these terrible things. I've gotten yelled at by a few parents on that, so.
Yeah, well, I would really tell the parents what to go do with themselves. It's like, guys, you are not in charge. We are going to teach your kids what they need to learn, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, whether it makes you feel good or not. That's reality. Get over it. Go home and whatever.
Well, I'll just, it's one of those unfortunate things where, and also, of course, the problem is that since textbooks are dominated by the Texas market, the California market, you often get a very badly warped choice of what textbooks you can get. Thank God that the ones that used by Bob Jones University aren't ever allowed in public schools, but that still can produce a problem. You've got California and then Texas as your choice. That's one reason I really hope that I am hoping that eventually with print on demand and e-books, you'll get an ability of most school districts to choose their own design of book rather than just sit back and wait for someone to provide it for them.
Oh, I'd rather they don't have a choice, to be really honest.
Well, I mean,
I'd rather, and we've talked about this, and I know we're going way the hell off topic, but I'd really rather have a mandatory minimum curriculum where We have experts in every single field who get together every couple years, and they decide what is important for every single student in the nation to learn.
I would agree.
At each grade level. And I'm talking about public, private, and home schools. This is what everybody's going to learn. You can teach more than this. You cannot teach less than this, because every single damn one of them is going to be tested on their knowledge.
I would agree. What I would argue for is then giving schools a little bit of flexibility, and maybe having a group of approved like chapters so the school can choose a la carte. You have to go for the minimum, and then we have a list of chapters and material that you can pick up beyond that. I do know that I have to admit, at some point, I am regretful that Bob Jones University probably won't be included in these lists of approved textbooks, because I must admit that stating that the Trail of Tears helped bring many Indians to God is true, just not in the way they intended, probably. But,
yes.
But no, it's Cuba, to conclude, I think that this was not going to hurt Obama politically. I don't think it's going to hurt the Democrats politically, because such a large percentage of Cubans have now started to argue that, we need more contact, the old policy has failed. And I think it will be tremendously beneficial economically, socially, and politically for both the United States and Cuba to start entering into a closer relationship. Pragmatically, as somebody who likes having a nice economy, I think it's long past time that the Europeans were able to play in Cuba without any competition from American interests.
Well, let's be honest. Most Americans probably aren't even aware that the Cuban embargo is still in place.
Yeah, that's true if you're private. Now, if you're trying to do business, you are. But yeah, I would like to see Cuba become just as close a part of the America as it was before the revolution. A bit more equal, obviously. We don't need to go back to some of the unpleasant bits. But, it'd be nice. Maybe Disneyland will expand out there.
Hey, we can definitely sell more cars there.
Yeah, and you know what? I'll bet you 5 minutes after the embargo comes down, you will have classic cars enthusiasts from all over America going to Cuba.
Yep.
But
because they got no end of them.
Oh yeah, they got no end of them, and that's. In fact, I know some people who have actually mentioned that they'll trade a 2011 car for one of those vintage 1950s.
Yep. All right. So, do we have anything else for the week?
No, I don't think so.
All right, so we will go ahead and wrap this one up. That's another one in the can. We'll be back in another week for another episode. We hope we can count on you to be waiting with bated breath, whatever that means. Make sure you let everyone know that we're here. Tell your friends on social media. Retweet our announcements on Twitter. We want to rebuild our following. We can't do it without you. So until we meet again, stay sane. Somebody has to counterbalance the religious crazies. Adios, all. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Bitchspot Report podcast. We invite listeners to interact with the show by commenting on our website at report.jdragononline.com. We can also be found on most social media sites, including Facebook, Google+, Tumblr, and Twitter. You can also listen on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and Player FM, as well as on the aforementioned website. New episodes post every Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific. Those interested in being on the air, please visit our website. All instructions are there. We appreciate our listeners and supporters. We couldn't do this without you.